The North is cold and full of whispers.
Before we get into it, if you want exclusive lore breakdowns, chapter timelines, and members-only videos that never make it to the main channel, the link is in the description. Everything lives on the Patreon. The Great Hall of Winterfell was full of the wrong kind of noise. It was the noise of men performing happiness. Lords who had ridden 3 days to stand in a line and bow, now drinking the king's wine and laughing the king's laughter, wearing the expression of men who had been told to celebrate and were doing it with the same mechanical effort they brought to most duties. The tallow candles threw everything amber. The smoke from the roasting spits moved along the ceiling in slow brown curls. The smell was venison fat, and trodden rushes and 300 southern bodies in clothes too fine for a northern winter. All of it undercut by something older and colder in the stones of the hall itself. The smell of Winterfell the way Winterfell always smelled underneath everything else, of granite and cold water, and the particular emptiness of a place that had been standing for 8,000 years and expected to be standing for 8,000 more. Robert Baratheon was at the high table. He had been loud for 2 hours. He was good at loud. 20 years on the throne had given him a king's version of it. Not the pure noise of a young man's vigor, but something more practiced, more performed, the sound of a man who had learned that kings are expected to fill rooms and had obliged ever since. His wine cup had been refilled 4 times. He had told the same story about the Battle of the Bells twice, once with better embellishments. He had slapped Ned on the shoulder hard enough to make the bench shift. He had made Ned show him the shape of a laugh, which was as much as Ned ever gave. And then, between one sentence and the next, Robert Baratheon stopped talking. It was a small thing. The lord beside him did not notice. Ned Stark noticed, because Ned had been reading Robert's face for 30 years and knew every register it was capable of. He had never seen this one. Robert's eyes had fixed on something across the hall. Ned followed the gaze. The far end of the hall, near the servants' tables, where the firelight was thinner and the benches older. Jon. The boy sat slightly apart, not by any rule anyone had laid down, but by the invisible gravity that bastards learn to apply to themselves from the moment they understand what they are. He was looking at his cup. He turned his head slightly, reaching for the bread, and the firelight came across his face at a particular angle. The gray of his eyes caught it, the specific gray of a winter sky seen from inside Winterfell's walls. The gray that Ned had spent 14 years looking at and not seeing what was in it. Robert set his wine cup down, not heavily, not with any of his usual declarative punctuation. He set it down the way a man sets something down when his hands need to be free. "I need air." His voice was completely ordinary. "Ned, walk with me." The corridors of Winterfell at night smelled of cold granite and old torch smoke. Robert walked fast for a man his size. Ned had always known that about him, the way his bulk moved with more purpose than anyone expected, the way the boy he'd been at 17 still lived inside the fat of him and came out in moments like this. His boots were loud on the stone, his hands were at his sides. He did not look back to confirm Ned was following. Ned followed. He had been Ned Stark long enough to know that the things Robert didn't say were almost always worse than the things he did. They went down. The door to the crypts was iron-bound oak, swollen slightly with the damp, the iron dark with age. Robert pulled it open without fumbling, without asking which door, as though the route from the Great Hall to Lyanna's tomb was something he had already walked in his mind enough times that his feet simply knew it. The stairs were narrow and spiraled down into a cold that rose to meet them, the specific cold of underground places, of still air that hadn't moved in decades, of stone that had never in its existence been warm. Ned took a torch from the wall sconce at the top of the stairs and carried it down after Robert into the dark. The crypts were vast and quiet and full of the stone faces of dead Starks. They lined the walls going back into a darkness the torchlight couldn't reach, kings and lords and warriors who had ruled the North in ages old enough that the names on some of their plinths had worn past reading. Each sat with an iron sword across its stone lap. Ned had grown up with these faces. He had sat beside these tombs when he needed to think, when Brandon died, when his father died, when he came back from the war carrying a secret he had never asked for. The faces had never offered him anything. They had never judged him either. They just sat in the dark and waited. The way the North itself waited, patient past any human patience. He knew where they were going without being told. Lyanna's tomb was at the end of the newer section. The stone was pale enough that the carving still held its edges sharp. The sculptor had worked from Ned's description, and Ned had given it hating every word, and the man had done something that was almost right. The stone Lyanna had her hair carved long, her face set in the same austere calm as every Stark above her. At the base of the tomb, dried roses, their color gone to brown, their petals crackling at a touch. Ned replaced them every year. He was not entirely sure why, except that she had loved them, and the dead could not tend their own memories, and someone had to. Robert stopped in front of her and looked at the carved stone face for a long time without speaking. When he spoke, he was still looking at her. "Whose son is he, Ned?" It was not a question. The inflection was completely flat, not furious, not grieving, just the voice of a man who had decided he was finished with the version of this conversation that allowed for false answers. Ned said nothing. "I've been watching that boy across feasting halls and practice yards and horse rides for 14 years. Robert's voice was still flat, telling myself I didn't see what I saw, telling myself I was drunk or tired or that grief does things to a man's eyes. A pause. I was never that drunk. He turned finally and looked at Ned directly for the first time since they'd left the hall. "Don't lie to me. Not here. Not in front of her." The silence in the crypts lasted for the count of 3 full breaths. The torchlight moved. The iron swords across the stone laps of dead kings caught it and threw it back dull. Then Ned Stark said, "He is Lyanna's." Robert went very still. Rhaegar took her. Ned's voice stayed level, not cold, not defensive, just the voice of a man saying a thing he had been holding inside his chest for 14 years and now had to release. "She bore the child in a tower in Dorne. I was there when she died. She made me promise to keep him safe. I brought him home, and I called him mine because the alternative was telling a grieving king that the woman he loved had died bearing another man's son. And I knew what you would have done to the boy." Robert's jaw worked. His hands, at his sides, had closed into fists, not in the way of a man about to strike, but in the way of a man who needs something to grip when everything else is moving. He was breathing audibly now. He turned back to the tomb. He looked at the stone face of Lyanna Stark, and something in his expression cracked. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical grief of a man who wants to be seen breaking, but in the small and terrible way of something that had been holding for a very long time and had reached the end of what it could hold. "Rhaegar's seed," he said, very quiet. "My Lyanna's son. He belongs to me." Ned watched him stand at the tomb and recognized the look. He had seen it once before, the morning after Lyanna's burial, when Robert had sat in the godswood without his cloak until Ned had found him blue with cold, staring at nothing with the expression of a man who had stopped arguing with a fact he could not unmake. This was that look again. Whatever argument had been happening inside Robert Baratheon since the moment he saw Jon Snow's gray eyes across the Great Hall was over. Something had decided. "What are you going to do?" Ned said. He made it a statement, not a question, because he was already certain of the shape of whatever was coming, and there was a difference between asking and bracing. "What I should have done 14 years ago." Robert turned around. The performance was entirely gone from his face. What was left underneath it was older and less comfortable but more real than anything Ned had seen from him in years. "I'm going to give him a name. A proper name. Baratheon on it. Stark underneath it. I'm going to send him somewhere no Lannister can reach him without starting a war." Ned said nothing. He waited. "Dorne." Robert said it like a man laying a stone on a table. "I've owed Arianne Martell something since the war. Everyone knows it. Nobody has done a damned thing about it because nobody wants to think too hard about what happened to Elia." His voice went flat on the name. "I'm going to think about it. I'm going to send Lyanna's boy to Sunspear as a ward of the crown, and I'm going to betroth him to Arianne Martell, Doran's heir, the future ruler of Dorne. And I'm going to do it with a decree that gives him enough standing that Cersei and her father cannot touch him without putting themselves at war with the North and Dorne at once." He paused. "He'll grow up in Sunspear. He'll have a Dornish education and a Dornish future. He'll have Doran's protection. And nobody in King's Landing has to know what he truly is." Ned studied him for a long moment. "Jon is 15 years old, Robert. Arianne Martell is 23. The betrothal doesn't mean the wedding happens tomorrow. It means the boy is protected. It means Doran has a stake in keeping him breathing." Robert's voice had the flat certainty of a man who had finished thinking and was now only explaining. "He can't stay here, Ned. Not now that I've seen him. Not now that I know. The Lannisters will notice eventually. They notice everything. I need him out of reach before that happens. And if Cersei sees the decree for what it is, an insult to Joffrey's succession, let her see it however she likes." Robert's eyes were steady, She can't move against a ward of the crown who is betrothed to the heir of Dorne without giving me the excuse I have been waiting for to be rid of her entirely. Something moved through his expression, something cold and finished. Let her try. Ned said, "You cannot tell him who his father truly is." Robert looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not objection, not denial, but a kind of exhausted recognition that the world was shaped the way it was shaped, and not any other way. "Rhaegar is dead," he said. "I'm the king. Jon Baratheon Stark is whoever I say he is." A pause. "I know what I am, Ned. I know what I did to the Targaryens. I'm not going to hang a dead man's name on a boy in the middle of a Lannister court and wait for someone to use it to slit his throat." His voice dropped. "Let him be Lyanna's boy. Let him be mine. That's enough. That's more than enough." Ned thought about 14 years of cold mornings and Catelyn's silence, and Jon's gray eyes asking nothing and deserving everything. He thought about the wall which had been waiting at the edge of this problem like an open drain, waiting to take the boy and swallow him. "All right," Ned said. Robert stood at the tomb a moment longer. His hand went to the stone, to Lyanna's carved cheek, to the face that was almost but not quite right. He pressed his palm flat against it, the way a man presses a hand against something he is trying to remember the weight of. He said nothing. Then he took his hand back. He straightened. He turned and walked toward the stairs, back toward the noise above, back toward the wine and the fire and the lords performing their happiness, the king's face already assembling itself around whatever it had just been. His boots were loud on the stone, and then they were at the stairs, and then the sound of them was gone, rising. Ned did not follow. He stood alone in the crypts with the stone face of his sister and the dead flowers at her feet, and the darkness pressing close at the edge of the torchlight, and he stood there long enough to say, in a voice too low for the dead to be bothered by, "This is what you asked for. This is close enough to what you asked for." He was not certain she would have agreed. He climbed back up toward the living. Jon Snow's hands were flat on the wooden surface of the lower table, and he was watching the door at the top of the hall. His hands were the hands of a boy who had grown up training in cold courtyards, the palms calloused along the grip ridges, the knuckles roughened from winters spent practicing with a wooden sword in frost before breakfast. They were still now, both of them, the way Jon had learned to hold himself still in public, since he was old enough to understand what bastard meant and what reactions cost. He was not certain what he was waiting for, but something in the previous night had changed the quality of the air inside Winterfell. Some atmospheric shift, the kind that arrives before weather, and the morning assembly had been called with more urgency than a feast day gathering usually warranted. Beside him, a space. Ghost was too large for the lower benches now, and had taken to lying under the table, the weight of him warm against Jon's boots. Jon looked at the door and waited. The great hall held them all. Robb was at the family table, taller than Jon remembered from the evening before, or perhaps simply more visible in the flat morning light, his auburn hair and his lord's son bearing and the careful calm he had worn since Robert's procession arrived. Arya was beside him, cross-legged on the bench in the way Septa Mordain had given up correcting. Sansa sat straight-backed in the dress she had chosen specifically for this occasion, her Tully hair neat, her eyes moving between the family table and the upper door, with the bright, expectant attention of a girl who had been told by every song she had heard that a king's attention meant something wonderful was about to happen. Catelyn Tully Stark stood behind the family table with her arms folded and her spine like an iron bar. She had been standing that way since Jon arrived. She did not look at him. On the other side of the hall, separated from the Stark household by the specific social distance that money and power and 20 years of carefully managed precedents create, the Lannister contingent. Cersei in pale gold, Joffrey beside her, wearing an expression of 12-year-old contempt that had been practiced so many times it had started to become the boy's actual face. The Kingslayer at the window, studying the courtyard outside as though the assembly was too dull to warrant his full attention. And slightly apart from all of them, at a small side table with a wine cup and a book he was not reading, Tyrion Lannister, watching everything with the bright, specific attention of a man who has learned that the best view of any spectacle is from the side. Robert entered from the upper door. He was sober, this was immediately visible. His walk was different, not the rolling, genial, wine-weighted sway of the previous evening, but something straighter and more deliberate. The walk of a man who had been a soldier before he was a king, and still remembered the difference between performing authority and exercising it. He wore no crown, just a Baratheon doublet in black and gold, his beard combed, his hands empty. He walked to the head of the hall and stopped and looked at the room until the room went quiet. And the quiet came quickly, because men who had served Robert Baratheon for 20 years had learned the difference between his moods. He took a rolled parchment from inside his doublet. He set it on the table in front of him. He unrolled it with one hand. He did not look at Cersei. Jon watched the parchment unroll and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a word for. Robert's voice, when he read, was not the voice of a man performing ceremony. It was the voice of a man who has decided something and is now saying it out loud for the first and last time. Let it be known throughout the 7 kingdoms. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The hall was that quiet. That I, Robert of House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the 7 kingdoms, protector of the realm, do hereby legitimize the bastard known as Jon Snow, born of the blood of my dearest companion Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, and of my own heart's truest love, Lyanna of House Stark. He paused. He looked up. Across the length of the hall his eyes found Jon at the lower table, and held him for 2 seconds, not unkindly, not with the elaborate performance of a man staging a dramatic moment, but with the direct, slightly exhausted look of a man who has made a decision and wants the person it concerns to hear it clearly. Then he looked back at the parchment. Let him henceforth bear the name Jon Baratheon Stark. Let him be counted as a noble-born son of the realm, of equal standing to any true-born lord, with all the rights, privileges, and dignities thereof. And let it further be known that I have arranged his betrothal to the Lady Arianne Martell, eldest daughter and heir to Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne, to be solemnized when the parties reach suitable age, as a gesture of the crown's love for Dorne, and as recompense for ancient debts of honor. He rolled the parchment back up. He looked at the room. Witnessed and sealed, he said. It is done. Jon did not move. He sat very still at the lower table with his hands flat on the wood, and he heard his name said differently for the first time in his life, and he felt the floor of everything he knew shift under him the way ice shifts on a river in the first days of thaw. Not breaking, not yet, just the first crack sound of something vast beginning to change. Not bastard, not Jon Snow, Jon Baratheon Stark. He did not show anything. He had trained himself not to show things in public since he was old enough to understand that bastards in great halls are watched for different reasons than true-born sons are watched. He sat with his back straight and his face still, and he listened to the rest of it. The betrothal, the heir to Dorne, the ancient debts, and he let each piece of it land on him and felt the weight of it without reacting to the weight. Under the table, Ghost pressed warm and heavy against his boots. Jon kept his eyes forward. He did not look at Ned. He was not certain he was ready to know what was in Ned's face. 3 tables to his left, Catelyn Stark's arms had tightened across her chest until her knuckles were pale. She had known some version of this. Ned had not told her what happened in the crypts, but she knew Ned, and she knew the difference between his ordinary silences and the kind he wore when something had been decided that he could not yet speak aloud. She had lain awake in the dark beside him and understood that the world was about to change shape and not known in which direction. Now she knew. The fury was immediate and it was genuine. The boy was being given a Baratheon name, a Stark name, a betrothal to the heir of Dorne. 14 years of careful practiced silence about who Jon Snow's mother was. And Robert Baratheon had just stood in her great hall and announced to 300 people that Lyanna Stark had a son, and the son was going to Dorne. And none of it had required Catelyn's agreement or even her knowledge before the parchment was prepared. She looked at Ned. His face was, as it almost always was, still. He was watching Robert. His expression gave her nothing except the faint, controlled quality she had learned to read as relief. Not guilt, not shame, relief. Her jaw tightened, but underneath the fury, moving in the dark below it like something she did not want to name, was something else. The boy was leaving. Jon Snow, Jon Baratheon Stark, was walking out of Winterfell with a king's name and a Dornish future, and he was not coming back to sit at the lower table and be the living question she could never ask. The thing she had looked at across the dinner table for 14 years and never fully been able to forgive or understand was going somewhere she would not have to see it. She knew what that feeling was. She knew how little she deserved to feel it. She unfolded her arms. She made her face do what it needed to do. Cersei Lannister smiled. The court smile, the one she had perfected at 9 years old in her father's halls, the one that showed exactly enough warmth to be read as gracious by anyone watching, and concealed everything else behind the specific flatness of very green eyes. She said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments. She did not look at Robert while he read the decree. She looked at the household. She read the room the way she always read rooms, looking not at faces but at the spaces between faces, at the directions people's eyes moved when they thought no one was watching them. Ned Stark's eyes had gone to the boy immediately, not with the expression of a man surprised by what he was hearing, with the expression of a man hearing something confirmed. He knew, he is known. This is not a spontaneous decree from a sentimental drunk. This was arranged. Ned Stark sat in those crypts last night and told Robert something he had been carrying for 14 years, and Robert spent his sober hours having his maester draft parchment. Her eyes moved to Joffrey, just for a moment. Mother. Joffrey's voice was low, clipped with the entitlement of a boy who had never once been told to be quiet in public. Why is father giving a bastard a Baratheon name? That's our name. The grip was firm enough to communicate exactly what it needed to communicate without anyone watching seeing more than a mother's gentle touch. Joffrey's mouth closed. Later, she said. She kept her voice soft and her smile in place. She would write to Casterly Rock tonight. Across the hall, Robb Stark had said nothing and done nothing and shown nothing. When Robert finished and the hall began to fill with the careful, cautious murmur of people deciding what they were allowed to feel about this, Robb turned his head slowly and found Jon at the lower table. Jon's eyes found him at the same moment, because they had always been able to find each other in rooms, even in crowds, even in darkness. Robb gave him the smallest nod. Not congratulations, not grief, just I see you. I'm still here. Jon looked at him for 1 second. Then he looked at his hands. They went to the Godswood before the packing started. It was the natural place. It had always been the natural place. The Godswood was the only part of Winterfell that had never felt like it belonged to any particular person's version of it. Not Catelyn's, not Robert's, not even Ned's. It was just Winterfell's oldest piece of itself, and it kept its own counsel. The heart tree's red carved face looked at nothing, the way it always looked at nothing. Robb said, "You were supposed to be going to the wall." Jon said, "I know, this is better." Jon turned to look at him. "Is it?" Robb's jaw worked for a moment. He was Ned's son in the way he approached a thing he didn't have words for. He circled it, let the silence do the initial work, and then said the thing that was underneath the thing he couldn't say. "You're going to be someone, Jon. Whatever else this is. Whatever else happens. You're going to be someone." He gripped Jon's shoulder. Hard, the way two boys who grew up training together grip each other, with the full weight of the hand and no performance in it. "Don't forget you're a Stark." Jon's jaw tightened. "I won't." They stood under the weirwood for another moment. The pale branches moved. The carved face looked at nothing. Neither of them said what they were actually thinking, which was that they did not know if they would stand here again together, and that the silences between them had always carried more than their words, and that this one was heavier than most. Arya found him in the yard. She did not say much. She was 9 years old, and she had never been good at the kind of speech that occasions like this seemed to require, the formal kind, the kind with meaning arranged neatly in it. What she did was hold out the wooden practice sword she had been training with, the one she had stolen from the armory 3 months ago, and not quite managed to keep secret from Sir Roderick, who had decided, in the particular way that Sir Roderick managed most situations that involved Arya, that not seeing it was easier than seeing it. She held it out with both hands. Her gray eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. Jon took the sword. He turned it over once in his hands. The wood was smooth where she'd worn it with use, rough where she hadn't reached yet. It was the most deliberately ordinary object he had ever been given, and the weight of it in his hands was extraordinary. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said what they actually meant, which was, "I don't know if I'll see you again, and I can't say that out loud because saying it makes it true." "Practice," she said. "More." "I know." He put the wooden sword in his pack. He pulled her in briefly, one arm, her head against his shoulder, the specific fierceness of a small person who does not want to be seen feeling things, and then he let her go. He found Ned in the outer corridor, alone, preparing to return to his solar. Jon stopped. Ned turned. They looked at each other in the way they had always looked at each other, at a slight remove from what they both felt, because that was how they were built, and neither of them had ever found a way around it. Jon said, "Robert asked you this morning." It was not a question. Ned said he did. A pause. The corridor was cold and quiet, and the sounds of the castle moved somewhere distant behind the stone. Jon looked at his father's face, the gray eyes that were the same gray as his own, the still expression that had carried 15 years of secrets without cracking, and understood what he was seeing. "You're going," Jon said. "Yes." Ned said it simply, not with apology, not with relief, with the specific quiet of a man who has made the harder choice and has accepted the weight of it. "What you told me last night, the danger you described, that is exactly why I must go. Not why I should stay. Robert needs someone beside him who already knows what they are walking toward. Because of you, I know. That is worth something." He paused. "It may be worth a great deal." Jon was quiet for a moment. He thought about the crypts, about what Robert's face had looked like standing at Lyanna's tomb, about the parchment decree and the word Baratheon Stark read aloud in the Great Hall, and the floor shifting beneath everything he had known. "Then we are both going south," he said. "In different directions." Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. The touch was brief, the way Ned's touches were always brief in public, but the weight of it was not brief at all. "Be careful in Dorne, Jon. Watch faces the way I taught you. Trust slowly. And whatever happens here," he did not say "if I do not return," because Ned Stark did not speak in those terms. "Remember that you belong to the north as much as anywhere. Remember what you are." Jon thought about the pool at the water gardens that he had not yet seen, but would stand beside someday looking at his own reflection. About all the names that would be laid on him before he was done. "I know what I am," he said. Ned looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the Stark nod. The nod that said everything it needed to say without requiring anything further. They parted in the corridor. Jon walked out of the great hall with his pack over one shoulder and Ghost at his heel. At the outer gate, the direwolf stopped. Ghost turned back, silver-white against the gray morning sky, enormous and quiet, the red eyes moving slowly across the walls and towers, and cold stone of the place they were leaving. He stood that way for a moment, reading something in Winterfell the way direwolves read things, through some sense that had no name in any human language. Then he turned south and followed Jon into the world. The 6 Stormland knights rode in Baratheon gold and black, and they were loud, not unpleasant. They were not cruel men, and they were not contemptuous of the North in the particular way some Southerners were contemptuous of it, with open dismissal and poorly concealed impatience for the cold. They were simply Southern, which meant they filled silence the way Southern men tend to fill silence, with noise, with laughter, with opinions about the quality of the road and the character of the weather, and the story of that time outside Storm's End when the food ran out, and they had eaten boot leather for a week and it had tasted better than the cook's stew anyway. They told the story in rotating parts. 3 of them had clearly told it before. 2 of them listened as though hearing it for the first time. 1 of them slept in the saddle and contributed to nothing. Jon rode at their center, in his dark Stark riding clothes, and said almost nothing for 2 days. Ghost padded alongside the horses. The knights had looked at the direwolf with professional unease on the first morning, and then when it became apparent that Ghost was not going to eat them or any of their horses, had calibrated their discomfort down to a low background awareness. They still gave him a wide berth. The wolf didn't appear to notice or care. Jon listened. He watched the road south unfold, the pines thinning as they descended, the gray sky pressing down, the frost in the morning grass giving way by midday to mud. He had ridden this road before, once, years ago with Ned. It had felt different then. Smaller. The road south had been a thing that led away from Winterfell towards something abstract and unknowable and very far. It still led away. That part was the same. Though now it led away from 2 people heading south instead of 1. White Harbor appeared first as a smell, salt and fish brine, and something Jon didn't have a name for. The particular chemical smell of trade, of goods from places he'd never been, of tar and foreign timber, and the accumulated residue of ships that had come from the free cities and the summer isles and places further still. Then the walls, white limestone, lower than Winterfell's and older looking, as though they had been worn down by the sea wind over generations. Then the harbor itself, full of masts, more masts than Jon had ever seen collected in one place, the ships swaying in the gray water like a forest that had decided to float. He had been here once before. He was certain of it. But it felt entirely different. The harbor master was a compact man of 50, with the complexion of someone who had spent his entire adult life outdoors, in bad weather. And he came down the dock at a quick walk when the Stormland escort was spotted, and he stopped in front of Jon, and he bowed. Not a half bow, not the performed incline that servants gave to lords they were technically obliged to acknowledge but hadn't decided to respect. A full, held bow, with the eyes down. Jon sat on his horse and understood that he had absolutely no idea what to do with this. "My Lord Baratheon Stark," the harbor master straightened. "Your ship is ready at the south dock, the galley Lyanna, by the king's own instruction." Jon said, "Thank you." It came out right, but he did not know quite where to put his hands. Ser Alistair Morrigan, riding just behind him, said nothing and showed nothing, which Jon was coming to understand was Ser Alistair's form of instruction. The ship was named Lyanna. Jon stood on the dock and looked at it for a moment, the carved name on the prow, in fresh gold paint on dark wood, the crowned stag above it in Baratheon black and gold, and let the particular weight of that settle on him the way things settled on him, quietly and without much ceremony. He didn't know what it meant that Robert had named it this. He understood it was either the most honest thing the king had done in years, or the heaviest possible way to make a point. He boarded and did not ask. The Lyanna was not a warship. It sat lower than a war galley and moved with the self-possession of a vessel that had been built for speed and relative comfort rather than combat. 50 oars, double-masted, with a covered aft cabin that smelled of new timber and lamp oil, a crew of 30 under a captain named Pylos, who shook Jon's hand once with a grip that communicated nothing except competence, and asked nothing that wasn't relevant to the voyage. That was when Jon met Podrick Payne. He was 16 years old, and he was waiting at the gangplank with his pack at his feet, and the expression of a person trying very hard to look like he had been waiting here for exactly the right amount of time and had not been waiting for longer. He was not tall, medium height, narrow in the shoulders, with dark hair and brown eyes, and the overall appearance of a boy who had spent most of his life trying not to be the most notable person in any room, with considerable success. He had a squire's posture, which was to say the posture of someone who had been trained to stand correctly and still looked slightly apologetic about the space they occupied. "My lord," he said, "I'm Podrick Payne. The king sent me as your squire." He paused, "Your personal squire, for the voyage and after." Another pause, "My lord." Jon looked at him. "Payne." He said the name the way you say a name when you're placing it. "Sir Ilan Payne is your kinsman." Podrick's expression did the specific thing that expressions do when something true and slightly uncomfortable has been said without warning. "Yes, my lord. A distant one, some remove of cousin." A beat. He doesn't speak. A further beat. "That's not why I don't speak much. I'm more of a listener." Jon looked at him for another moment. Then, "All right, Podrick, get your pack. We're boarding." The relief on Podrick's face was entire and unguarded and immediate. He picked up his pack with both hands. The morning after departure, Jon was given the cloak. Podrick brought it at dawn, folded over both arms, the way you carry something you've been told is important, and held it out. It was Baratheon gold, heavy wool with a clasp in the shape of the crowned stag. Not ceremonial. A traveling cloak, made for wear. Made for him, specifically, Podrick explained, with the earnest precision that Jon was beginning to recognize as his particular form of communication, that the king's own steward had given the measurements, and that the clasp was solid bronze, not plate, because plate was too heavy for daily use. Jon took it. The wool was thicker than his northern cloaks, better against rain than against cold, which made sense, given where he was going. He put it on. He buckled the clasp. He went up to the prow. White Harbor was still visible astern. Just a white smear above the gray water, the masts of the harbor shrinking into a line, and then into a suggestion, and then into something that required him to already know it was there in order to see it. North of that, invisible now, too far, Winterfell, the Godswood, the crypts, Robb's face in the weirwood light, Ned preparing to ride south to King's Landing with open eyes and full knowledge of what he was walking toward. He stood at the prow of a ship named after his father's sister, wearing the colors of a king who had fought a war over her, watching the north disappear behind him. And he was 15 years old, and he did not know how to be the person the gold cloak said he was. Ghost stood beside him. This was the only thing that made sense. The sea was enormous, and Jon did not like it. He had seen water before, the rivers of the north, the frozen shores of the Bay of Ice in winter, the harbor at White Harbor from the dock. But the harbor was bounded, contained, its distances legible. The open sea was not. The open sea did not have edges that Jon could see, and the horizon was too far and too flat, and the water moved constantly in a way that was entirely unlike anything solid, shifting under the ship in long gray-green swells that lifted the hull and set it down again with a rhythm that Jon's body never quite managed to predict. He was not sick. He had made a decision about that. He stood on the deck in the cold spray and let his body figure out the rhythm, and showed nothing on his face while his stomach quietly objected to everything. Ghost, to his personal annoyance, seemed entirely unbothered by the sea. The wolf sat at the prow with his ears forward and his red eyes on the horizon, with the specific contentment of a creature encountering something new and finding it interesting. Jon kept his eyes forward and did not mention his stomach to anyone. Ser Alistair Morrigan was 52 years old, hard and lean, with a scar along his jaw that he'd taken at the siege of Storm's End, and he had the quality that men develop after a long time in other people's company of being able to say a great deal with almost no preamble. On the second night at sea, he sat across from Jon at the aft cabin table with a cup of wine and said, "You know nothing about Dorne." Jon said, "I know it's hot. That's the beginning of what you know and the end of it." Morrigan drank. "They don't fight like us. They don't think like us. They don't respect what we respect. Power to a Dornishman is not the loudest man or the biggest army. Power's the man in the room who already knows what you're going to say before you open your mouth." He looked at Jon steadily. "Don't walk into Sunspear trying to be the most important person there. You will not be. You may not be the most important person in any room in Dorne for a very long time. That is fine. That is correct. Watch. Learn. Decide what you think of them after you actually know what you're looking at." He paused. "And don't tell them you know nothing about Dorne. They'll tell you that themselves, and it'll go better if you let them do it." Jon said, "What are they like?" "The Martells." Morrigan was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. "Doran Martell is the most patient man I have ever heard of, and I have never met him. That is how thoroughly the quality precedes him." Another pause. "His brother Oberyn is the second most dangerous man in Westeros, after the Kingsguard. Maybe before them. He studied poison at the Citadel and fighting styles in the fighting pits of Essos, and he has been in more duels than I have had bad harvests." He looked at Jon. "He may want to test you. If he does, let him. Do not try to win. Try to last." Jon listened and said nothing and remembered all of it. They stopped at Dragonstone on the 4th day for water and provisions. The castle rose from the sea on its volcanic island. Black rock, black walls, every surface carved into the shape of dragons by hands that had been doing that particular work for centuries. The gargoyles, the towers, the gatehouse with its stone dragon neck arching overhead. Nothing about it looked like it had been built. It looked like it had grown or been summoned from the specific dark imagination of people who had lived with dragons for so long they could not conceive of architecture that did not also breathe. Jon stood at the ship's rail and looked at it. "Old Targaryen seat," Morrigan said, coming to stand beside him. "Built before King's Landing, before the Conquest. Even they came from Valyria and settled here a century before Aegon crossed. Stone and dragonfire." He looked at the castle. "Nobody lives there now except Stannis Baratheon, and he hates it. Too cold, too far from the politics." He looked at the castle. "Strange place, the rock smells of sulfur on a hot day. The ravens that nest here are different from other ravens. Larger, quieter." Jon was not listening to the last part. He was looking at the castle. Something in him had gone quiet and attentive in a way that was different from his ordinary attentiveness, the trained observational quiet he wore in most rooms. This was something else. Something that felt less like observation and more like recognition, which made no sense, because he had never been here, had never seen this place. At his side, Ghost made a sound he rarely made. Low, barely audible, not quite a growl. The sound a wolf makes when it scents something it cannot fully categorize. Jon looked at the wolf. Ghost looked at the castle. His red eyes were entirely still. They resupplied. They left. 3 days south of Dragonstone, the sea changed. The gray-green of the water off the north gave way to something deeper, a blue that was not the pale, cold blue of the Bay of Ice, but something warmer and denser and more certain of itself. The air changed with it, the cold that Jon had worn his entire life, not just the physical cold of Winterfell and northern winters, but the internal cold of bastard and invisible, and the particular chill of being present in rooms without belonging in them. That cold did not leave, but it loosened, the way cold loosens when something warm comes near enough to make its edges uncertain. Jon noticed it and did not know what to make of it. He went below deck that night with the sound of the warmer sea against the hull, and reached into his pack for his spare boot, and his hand found something that wasn't a boot, a piece of folded parchment. Arya's handwriting on the outside, his name in her precise and slightly aggressive script, the letters pressed hard into the page the way she did everything. He held it by the lamp. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it again. He folded it carefully and put it inside his shirt, against his skin, next to the place where the warmth was. Then he lay down in the dark with the sea moving around him, and the ghost of everything he had been slipping away behind the ship in the black water. And he looked at the ceiling, and he let himself think about where he was going. Oberyn Martell rode into the Shadow City without announcing his return to anyone, which was, according to Podrick, who had been asking the household staff careful, quiet questions in the way that Podrick asked most things, like a man who understood that patience was its own form of inquiry, exactly what he always did. Jon heard the commotion from the training yard before he saw it. Not a loud commotion, a particular kind of noise, the specific atmospheric shift that happens when a personality arrives rather than simply a person. He climbed the inner wall and looked down into the street below. The procession was not large. Oberyn rode at its head, lean and dark and conspicuously unhurried, sitting his horse with the loose confidence of a man to whom physical things had stopped requiring conscious effort a long time ago. He was somewhere past 40, and looked it in the way that certain men look their age, not diminished by it but marked by it, in ways that added rather than subtracted. Harder at the jaw, more precise in the eyes, the body honed rather than worn. Beside him rode Ellaria Sand, dark-eyed and dark-haired, and wearing the bearing of a woman who had made her peace with being watched long ago. 3 of his daughters rode behind, the Sand Snakes the household called them, though they offered the name in a tone that suggested daughters was the word to use in company. Oberyn looked up as he passed below the wall. He looked up directly at Jon, with the unerring accuracy of a man who had already catalogued every person watching him before he appeared to have noticed anyone at all. He smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, not warm, not cold, but sharp in the specific way of something that knew exactly what it was doing and had decided not to conceal it. He rode on. That evening at dinner, Oberyn Martell looked at Jon for approximately 10 seconds before he said anything. It was not simply the assessing look of a man sizing up a fighter, though there was that in it. It was the look of a man who had spent decades studying human beings with the same forensic interest he brought to poisons and to fighting styles, combining everything he observed into a single complete picture before committing to speech. He looked at Jon. He looked at Doran. He looked at Jon again. Whatever he communicated to his brother in that look, Doran received without visibly responding. Then Oberyn said, "Jon Baratheon Stark." He tried the name at a measured pace, as though listening for what it revealed about itself in the air. "That is a considerable mouthful of a name. Tell me, which part do you actually feel?" Jon looked up from his plate. The question was direct in a way the previous 3 days of Sunspear's diplomatic courtesies had not been. "Neither," he said. Yet, Oberyn's smile sharpened at one corner. "Honest?" He lifted his wine cup. "Good. That answer will either get you killed or keep you alive, depending entirely on when and to whom you say it." He drank. "I appreciate that you said it to me. It saves a considerable amount of time." At the far end of the table, Doran sat with his hands folded and his face giving nothing away. Arianne watched the exchange with the expression of a woman in the process of adjusting a calculation. The morning after Oberyn's arrival, he was in the training yard before dawn. Jon found him moving through forms with his spear, a length of ashwood tipped with dark steel, handled the way most men handle a part of themselves, without thinking about the mechanics. Oberyn moved with the economy of someone from whom all superfluous motion had been stripped away long ago by the specific education of surviving real violence many times. He stopped when Jon came through the gate. "Good," Oberyn said. "Early, that tells me something." His eyes went to Jon's sword. "Leave it." Jon set it on the bench. Oberyn tossed him a practice spear without warning. Jon caught it. It was heavier toward the butt than he had expected, balanced entirely differently from a sword, and the wrongness of it settled immediately into his grip, the subtle physical protest of a body that knows only one method and is being handed a tool that requires another. "Show me," Oberyn said. Jon attacked. Oberyn redirected the thrust with the shaft of his spear, pivoted laterally, brought the butt around in a low arc that swept Jon's leading ankle, and put him on the sand in under 3 seconds. Jon got up and said nothing. He attacked differently, feinted low, committed high. Oberyn read the feint from its second stage, not its first, changed the angle of his body by half a step, caught Jon's forward weight at the shoulder, and put him down again. Not hard enough to injure, hard enough to be unambiguous. Jon got up again. On the third bout, he stopped attacking entirely. He circled. He kept the distance open and moved laterally, watching Oberyn's feet rather than his hands, looking for the pattern underneath the variation the way he had watched the guard in the yard 3 days ago, but at a level several orders of magnitude more complex. Oberyn moved with him, patient and unhurried, offering nothing. Jon watched and waited, and then deliberately, openly left a gap on his right side. Not a real gap. Bait, and obvious bait. Oberyn saw it for what it was, and was fast enough to exploit it regardless, because experience at this level made speed almost irrelevant. He committed to the thrust. In the half-second of that commitment, Jon had the angle he'd been waiting for. He used it. The practice spear tip grazed Oberyn's left ribs before Oberyn closed the distance and ended it, putting Jon on his back in the sand for the third time. Jon lay there for a moment, looking at the pale, Dornish sky above the yard. He heard Oberyn walk to the bench and sit. "You don't fight like a Baratheon," Oberyn said. Jon sat up. How does a Baratheon fight? Straight ahead, loudly, with considerable confidence that being large and correct is sufficient. A pause. It often is. That is the problem with it. It teaches the wrong lesson. He looked across the yard. You fight like a wolf. How does a wolf fight? It loses. Oberyn said it simply, without unkindness, without mockery. It loses the first time and it adjusts. It loses the second time and it adjusts differently. The third time it does something it has not done before, because a wolf does not repeat what hasn't worked. That particular stubbornness belongs to men who have decided their honor requires them to try the same thing until it either works or kills them. He turned the practice spear over in his hands. You just showed me 3 different fighters in 3 bouts. That quality cannot be taught. It is a quality of mind. He looked at Jon. Your father Ned fights like a Baratheon, incidentally. Straight, honorable, and brutal. That is a genuine compliment from him. From you, it would be a waste. He stood. You have something more interesting than honor in your hands. Let me teach you what to do with it. What followed was not comfortable, and Oberyn made no effort to make it so. He taught with the total honesty of someone who considered anything less than the truth a form of personal inefficiency. He did not praise what was not worth praising. He did not soften corrections. He had no patience for the specific kind of pride that made a student repeat their mistakes in order to avoid appearing to learn from them. The spear first. Oberyn made Jon drill footwork without the weapon at all for the first 4 days, moving through patterns in the sand for an hour at a time, planting weight, shifting center, changing direction, until the geometry lived in Jon's legs and hips before his hands were asked to add the instrument. The spear, Oberyn said, was not a sword with a long handle. It was an entirely different argument about distance. A sword said, "I will come to you." A spear said, "You will come to me, and I will decide when." They will underestimate it, Oberyn said. Let them. It is one of the few gifts your enemies will give you freely. Do not correct them. Then poison framed not as offense, but as survival. He set out a row of clay jars on the yard bench and worked through them with the brisk, clinical precision of a man delivering information he expected to be retained. The smell of nightshade, and how it differed from the more subtle sour leaf. The specific progression of manticore venom through the body, and the window of time a man had to act before the paralysis reached the chest. The tears of lice, which had no smell, and the method of identifying it by ruling out everything else. How to slow a fast-acting compound with a tourniquet applied above the point of entry. A ward of Dorne, Oberyn said, should know how to survive Dorne. There is no shame in the knowledge. The shame is in dying from ignorance of it. And then the thing Oberyn called information. The most dangerous man in any room, he said one evening, sitting on the wall above the training yard with the lamplit city spreading below, is never the strongest one. He is rarely the smartest. He is the one who knows something no one else in that room knows. He looked at Jon steadily. Everyone else in a fight, a real fight, a political fight, a fight with money or words or armies, is working from what they can see. You want to be working from what they cannot see. He gestured at the city below, at its layered noise and light. I have been in 9 free cities. I have sat at tables in courts that would have paid heavily to have me removed, and I am here. Not because I am the most dangerous man at those tables, because I knew things about the people at those tables that they did not know I knew. He paused, Learn this city, learn this household, what the servants say before the family enters, what the lords say when Doran's back is turned, what Arianne believes she is not showing. He looked at Jon. By the time you need those skills somewhere that matters, they should feel as natural as breathing. Jon noticed Doran's attitude toward bastards the way you notice the absence of something you have been carrying so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. There was no particular moment, no declaration, no ceremony of acceptance. It was simply that in the Shadow City, in the training yard, in Doran's household. No one used the word in the way he had grown up hearing it used. The Sand Snakes existed openly, acknowledged and present and entirely without apology. The word bastard here was a descriptor. The way tall was a descriptor, the way northern was a descriptor, not a verdict, not a designation for the space at the edge of the table. Jon did not mention this to anyone. He simply noticed it, and filed it and carried it more quietly than he had carried most things. 3 weeks in, Arianne stopped pretending she was not watching. Jon was running spear forms alone at dusk when she appeared at the archway. She didn't come in. She stood and watched him move, still imperfect in the shoulders, still slightly too committed on the forward thrust, but learning in the visible, progressive way that Oberyn had told him was his best quality, for 2 minutes without speaking. Then, you held Ghost back yesterday when he growled at the merchant in the south courtyard. Her voice was neutral, factual, a wolf that obeys. I didn't think that was possible. Jon lowered the spear. He doesn't obey because I command him, he said. He obeys because he trusts me. Arianne was quiet for a moment. She had the quality, in real thought, of going very still. The performance of ease dropping entirely, just briefly, and something more precise taking its place. Dorne needs to trust you before it follows you, she said. That is not a command situation. You cannot decree it into existing. I know, Jon said. She looked at him for another moment, then she turned and walked back through the archway without further ceremony. That night, Doran received his daughter in the private study. He waited. The boy, Arianne said, sitting in the chair she had sat in for political conversations since she was 17. He may not be a disaster. Doran's expression didn't change. He nodded, very slightly, with the air of a man receiving information he had already incorporated. The evening Oberyn mentioned Elia, they were sitting on the wall above the training yard. The Shadow City was doing what it did at that hour, lighting itself from within as the sun pulled back, torches appearing in windows and along the street junctions, the daytime noise softening but not stopping, because the Shadow City did not fully stop. Oberyn was cleaning his spear with a cloth, working from the steel tip down the shaft in slow, even strokes. The motion was habitual, the attention elsewhere. Jon said, "Why are you teaching me?" Oberyn didn't answer immediately. He kept working the cloth along the shaft and looked out at the city below. "My sister was Rhaegar Targaryen's wife," he said. His voice was level, not cold, but deliberately flattened, the specific register of a man addressing something that still has the capacity to move him and has decided it will not move him tonight. Arianne Martell. She was Doran's sister and mine, and she was kind, which people do not remember about her because she died in a way that does not invite people to think about who she was before it. A pause. Rhaegar left her. He rode to a tournament and put a crown of blue roses on another woman's head and rode away from Elia and everything she had given him, and eventually she and her children died for it. Another pause. Longer. You are not responsible for any of that. The city hummed below them. But you carry something of it, Oberyn said. Whether you know it or not, whether I can explain precisely what it is or not. He finished with the cloth. He held the spear upright and looked at the tip for a moment, checking something invisible. Then he stood. I want to see what you do with that weight. He picked up his spear and walked toward the stairs without looking back. Dawn tomorrow. Don't be late. Jon sat alone on the wall above the lit city and said nothing. He did not know yet what he carried, but he was beginning to feel the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of something in the dark by pressing your hands against it carefully before you can see what it is. The summons came through Maester Caeliot an hour after the household had retired. A folded note, 3 words in Doran's handwriting, delivered to Jon's chamber without explanation or ceremony. Tower. Now. Alone. Jon dressed, left Ghost sleeping in the corner, and went. The stairs of the Tower of the Sun wound in a tight spiral. The light came from oil lamps set into alcoves at every 7th step, and the flames moved when Jon passed, guttering in the small displacement of air his body made going upward. The shadows responded to each gutter, stretching and contracting along the curved stone walls, making the carved Roynish faces seem briefly animate before settling again. The smell was old stone and lamp oil and something faintly mineral, the compressed smell of a tower that had been standing in desert heat for generations and held the memory of every season in its walls. Jon climbed. He did not know what he was climbing toward. At the top, a door, heavy, old, the iron fittings gone dark with age. He pushed it open. The chamber was round, with windows on all sides, not plain glass but colored crystal set in the frames, each pane a different shade, amber and blue and deep green, so that the moonlight coming through arrived in fragments of color that lay across the stone floor in irregular pools. It made the room feel sealed, like a place where the ordinary rules of the world outside had been temporarily suspended in favor of something older and more considered. Doran Martell sat in his chair facing the largest window, the one opening south over the sea. His back was to the door. He did not turn when Jon entered. "Close it," he said. Jon closed the door. Doran was quiet for a moment, looking at the sea through the colored glass. Then he spoke. "When Rhaegar Targaryen rode to war," he said, "he left behind a wife and 2 children in King's Landing. He also left behind a secret." A pause. A secret that Elia knew and kept, because she loved him despite what he had done, because she was that kind of woman. His voice carried the specific flatness of someone addressing a fact they have held a long time without ever being permitted to put it down. "I am not telling you this to speak well of Rhaegar. I am telling you because the secret matters, and because you are old enough now to carry the weight of what it means." Jon sat in the chair across from him. The colored light lay between them on the floor. "What secret?" Jon said. Doran reached to the table at his right and lifted a folded document. He held it on his lap without opening it immediately, in the way of a man handling something he has examined many times and has not yet fully decided how much of its weight he has made peace with. "My network has been thorough for a long time," he said. Among other qualities, Doran Martell is meticulous. He opened the document. This is a compilation drawn from 3 separate reports. A servant in the village below the Tower of Joy in Dorne, a Dornish merchant who traded with the Targaryen household in the years before the war, and a member of the Faith of the Seven who performed a private ceremony in a sept in Dorne in the final year before the rebellion. He looked at Jon. 3 Kingsguard were stationed at the Tower of Joy. Not 1, not 2. 3. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning. Sir Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander. Sir Oswell Went. He allowed a pause. 3 members of the Kingsguard do not stand outside the room of a woman taken against her will. They guard a queen, or they guard someone whose life is worth a king's complete protection. He set the document on the table. The servant in the village below the tower heard a child crying on the day before Eddard Stark arrived, not an infant who had been there for weeks. A child, new on that specific day, crying for the first time. The colored light lay still between them. Blue on stone, amber on stone. "The ceremony," Jon said. His voice was careful and level. He was following this the way you follow a trail you already sense leads somewhere irreversible. "A septon performed a marriage," Doran said, "between a prince of the royal house and a woman of the north. In secret, before witnesses, in the full name of the 7, he set the document aside and was quiet for a moment, and something moved across his face that was not the measured, controlled expression he maintained in most rooms. It was briefer than grief and sharper than bitterness. For the marriage to stand as legal under the faith, Rhaegar had the High Septon dissolve his marriage to Elia first. That dissolution is in the record as well. He let that sit for a moment. The colored moonlight lay between them and did not change. My sister's marriage was erased by a notation in a Septon's book. Elia did not choose that erasure. She was not consulted. She learned of it, I believe, and she kept it anyway because she was the kind of woman who loved even the things that cost her everything." He paused again, with the precise control of a man who has held something very still for a very long time. "I have been sitting with that record for 15 years. I wanted you to know I understand what the legal validity of this marriage was built upon, and what it cost." He folded his hands. He returned to the even register. The marriage to Lyanna was valid, fully documented, which makes the child born in that tower legitimate. Silence. Doran leaned forward. With both hands, carefully, with the deliberate gentleness of someone handling something that matters and is aware that it matters, he took Jon's face and turned it toward the moonlight coming through the colored glass. He examined Jon's face for a long moment. His thumbs rested lightly at the jaw. His dark eyes moved across Jon's features with the focused precision of a man confirming a document against its source. "Your eyes," he said, "gray, from your mother." He was quiet another moment, but the rest, the line here, a finger indicated the cheekbone, the brow, the jaw beneath it. He studied. "I knew Rhaegar Targaryen, not well, but I stood in the same hall as him on 7 occasions over the years, and I have always remembered faces precisely." He released Jon and settled back in his chair. The implication should not require me to complete it. Jon did not move. Doran said, "You are Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's legitimate son, born of his marriage to Lyanna Stark, born in that tower in Dorne on the day before Eddard Stark arrived and found his sister dying. Lord Stark found the marriage record. He has kept it hidden for 15 years, in a place I do not know but could find if I needed to, because Eddard Stark is thorough, and he loves you in the way that men love what they have decided to protect without limit." A pause. "You are not a bastard. You have never been a bastard. You have more right to the Iron Throne than any living person in the 7 kingdoms." He paused once more. "Rhaegar had a son by Elia also named Aegon, who was murdered in the sack of King's Landing as an infant. Whether history will count that child as Aegon the Sixth or not, whether your number is 6th or 7th, is a question for maesters and chronicles. What is not a question is your blood, your legitimacy, and your claim." Jon looked at his hands. He did not know, later, why that was the first thing he did, only that his eyes went there, to his hands resting on his thighs, the calloused palms, the sword-roughened knuckles, the hands of a boy who had grown up in Winterfell as a bastard, who had carried that word the way you carry a weather condition so long you stop registering it as a thing imposed from outside, and begin to experience it as simply the climate of your existence. Not a bastard. Had never been a bastard. The word and every interior structure it had built in him across 15 years was founded on nothing. Built on air. Built on a lie told to protect him from the people who would have killed him for the truth. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, heir to the 7 kingdoms before Robert's warhammer found him at the Ruby Ford and scattered the gems from his chest into the river, where they still lay embedded in the pale stones, catching whatever light the water allowed them. At Dragonstone, Jon had stood at the ship's rail and felt something he could not name. Ghost had growled at something Jon couldn't see. Now he understood the pull of that place, and it was almost worse than not understanding it. The blood in him reaching for the stone that had been shaped by the same blood, and the blood not knowing why and Jon not being able to tell it. He breathed. He kept his hands still. 2 facts sat inside him simultaneously and would not combine. The first, he was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, the legitimate son of the last crown prince of the Targaryen dynasty, born of a legal marriage with a claim to the throne that predated Robert's by blood and by law both. The second, his father's choices had killed his mother, had killed Arianne Martell, whose marriage had been erased from the records so another woman could take her place, who had watched it happen and loved Rhaegar anyway and died for it screaming in King's Landing, had killed thousands in a war fought over a woman Rhaegar had already set aside his wife for, had set in motion every grief that had followed. Rhaegar Targaryen had been a great prince and a spectacular fool, and Jon was his son, and there was nothing to do with that except hold it. "Does Arianne know?" Jon said. "She does now," Doran said. Jon absorbed this without comment. He thought about the recent shift in her, the precise quality of her attention in the past week, the specific way she had been watching him that was different from the way she had been watching him before. She had known and said nothing and watched anyway. He filed it. He was quiet for a long time. The moonlight through the colored crystal moved as a cloud shifted somewhere above the sea. Then, "You are asking me to claim a throne by telling the world I am the son of the man who started a war that killed thousands." He looked at Doran directly. "Including your sister. Including her children, who were also my father's children, by the woman whose marriage he erased." He paused. "And you believe the realm will accept this?" Doran allowed himself the small, controlled shift at one corner of his mouth that served him in place of a smile. "No," he said. "Westeros will not simply accept it. Westeros is not a structure that accepts things which complicate its existing arrangements without considerable resistance." He folded his hands on his lap. "Westeros will need to be convinced. That is what armies are for." He looked at Jon without hurry. but it is considerably easier to convince a realm once the war is already decided. Win first, name the victory afterward. The name becomes legitimate when it is the only name left standing. A pause. My sister was murdered, her children were murdered. Rhaegar is dead. Aerys is dead. The entire dynasty was reduced to ash, and 2 surviving children, one of whom is dead, and one of whom is across the narrow sea with no knowledge you exist. He let that sit, and then there is you, walking into my courtyard courtesy of a drunken Baratheon who believed he was being clever. He looked at Jon. I want you to take the Iron Throne, with Arianne beside you as queen, and Dorne behind you as your hammer. I am telling you this plainly because I am old and my joints ache, and I have spent 15 years being indirect, and I find at this distance from when it began that plain is faster. Jon looked at him across the colored light. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I will marry Arianne. Doran waited. I will do it as Jon Baratheon Stark, because that is who I am right now. It is the only name I currently know how to be. He looked at his hands again, then back at Doran. I am not Aegon Targaryen yet. I may never be. I do not know what that name asks of a man, or whether I am capable of what it requires, or whether the realm deserves to have it forced on them as one more thing they were given no choice about. He paused. But I will not be named by anyone else. Not by Robert, who named me for his grief. Not by you, who names me for your strategy. When I understand what it means to carry it and decide I am ready, I will claim it myself. Not before. The colored light lay between them on the floor. The sea moved beyond the window, dark and enormous, indifferent to the conversation happening above it. Doran studied him for a long moment, with the specific, entirely still attention of a man taking the full measure of something he cannot afford to miscalculate. Then he nodded. That, he said, is the first thing you have said to me that sounds like a king. Jon descended the stairs alone. He went down through the guttering lamps, past the shadows on the curved walls, past the old stone that remembered every season, the spiral of it unwinding him back toward the ground level and the sleeping castle, and the ordinary world that was no longer ordinary. Halfway down, he stopped. He sat on the step in the dark. He put his face in his hands. He was not crying. There was nothing in him reaching for that. The thing was too large for it, too complete, too total, the ordinary instruments of grief not calibrated for something at this scale. He sat with it instead, in the dark, holding it the only way it could be held. The way Ned Stark had always stood in the crypts of Winterfell, among the stone faces of his ancestors, in the absolute still of underground places, as though stillness were the only armor that worked against certain kinds of knowledge, and you simply wore it until the knowledge became something you could walk with. Jon sat on the step. He held it. The first raven arrived at dawn. Robert Baratheon was dead. He had died of the boar hunt wounds 3 days after the injury, in his bed in the Red Keep, the maesters unable to do what he had prevented them from doing when it might still have mattered. The language of the message was formal, correct, and said nothing about the wine being made too strong before the hunt. The second raven arrived the following morning. Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, had been crowned king of the 7 kingdoms in the great sept of Baelor. Cersei Lannister served as queen regent. Janos Slynt, who had commanded the city watch under Robert and who had delivered it into Lannister hands the moment Robert stopped breathing, had been confirmed in his position and rewarded with a lordship. The gold cloaks were a Lannister instrument now, and King's Landing belonged to the family that had always intended to own it. The third raven arrived that evening, delayed, the parchment damaged at one corner as though it had changed hands more than once before finding its way south. The handwriting was Ned Stark's. The lions have the city. Robb is raising the north. Whatever you can bring, bring it now. Doran convened the Dornish lords in the Tower of the Sun the following morning. He did not perform grief for Robert Baratheon because he had never been Robert Baratheon's ally, only Jon's patron, and performing something that was not true was a habit Doran had broken long ago, as an inefficient use of resources he needed elsewhere. He sat in his chair at the head of the council table and looked at his lords with the expression he wore when the thinking was already complete and what remained was execution. Robert Baratheon is dead, he said. His legitimate heir, Jon Baratheon Stark, ward of the crown, my son-in-law, a man under the full protection of this house, has been denied his lawful claim by a usurpation staged by Cersei Lannister on behalf of a boy who is not Robert's heir in any sense that the law of the 7 kingdoms would recognize. He paused for the length of one breath, Dorne has suffered enough from the convenience of the powerful. We will not suffer this one. Jon sat at the table to Doran's left, Arianne at Doran's right. The Dornish lords looked at Jon with the assessing attention of men deciding whether something is worth following. He was 16 years old, wearing the armor with the sun and the wolf on the breastplate, Ghost at his feet, and the Dornish spear at his back that Arianne had given him at the wedding. He had the bearing of someone who had been training under Robert Martell for 3 months, and whose body had been changed by it. He said nothing during the council, because nothing he could have said would have been more persuasive than his presence in the room, and Doran had always known the difference between an argument and a demonstration. The lords called for war. Dorne fielded 25,000. Jon watched them assemble on the open ground south of Sunspear over 3 days of organized efficiency, and looked at the morning light on their weapons when the vanguard formed up at dawn on the first day, the steel tips catching the sun in a line that extended further than he could see in either direction, and named them, privately, the Golden Spears. An unofficial name, the kind of name that attaches itself to things before anyone decides it's attaching, and becomes permanent afterward when the songs are written. Oberyn commanded the van. This was the correct military decision, which was why Doran had made it. Jon rode at the head of the main column alongside Arianne, the black and orange plate from the wedding, the spear at his back, the Stark sword at his hip. Arianne had returned the sword the morning after the wedding, setting it in his hands without ceremony. "You will need it more than I will," he had not argued. Above them, the standard Doran had commissioned, the sun and wolf combined sigil, quartered in orange and black and gray, 3 colors for 3 houses, the most legible political argument currently moving through the Prince's Pass on horseback. Jon was not leading the host. Oberyn led the host. But his presence at the head gave the march its meaning, and Doran had always understood that legitimacy and command were different instruments, and knowing which one a situation required was the beginning of competence. The march took 3 weeks for the cavalry van, through the Prince's Pass first, where the mountains between Dorne and the Reach funneled the column to a width that made the army's full length invisible. Only the road ahead, and the riders behind, and the indifferent stone of the mountains on each side. Then northwest through the Reach, keeping distance from Highgarden, the Tyrells watching from their castle, and not yet committed to anyone, a quality Jon had stopped resenting because Oberyn had explained it once, briefly. People who wait until the correct side is clear are not cowards. They are people you can negotiate with. Never resent the negotiable. The Dornish marched the way the Dornish had always marched. No attrition. No grinding of morale against the heat that was simply their own climate returned to them. They moved through it the way a river moves through its own country, without the effort of crossing something foreign. Oberyn noted once that Jon was keeping pace. He said it without inflection. This was the highest form of Oberyn's commendation. North of the Neck, Robb Stark had been at war. He had crossed the Twins with 18,000 men and moved fast, because Robb Stark had the Stark gift for ground. The instinct for where to stand, for when to commit, for reading the moment an opponent had committed wrong and acting in the space that opened. He had freed Riverland's allies, he had beaten 3 Lannister engagements, his bannermen had declared him king in the north, at a war council because that was the specific loyalty Robb generated in men who had watched him fight, and because the north needed a name above its armies. He did not know Jon was coming. He knew Jon had sent a warning letter from Sunspear months ago. He did not know the size of what that letter had set in motion. The Ruby Ford was shallow and cold. The Trident ran north through the Riverlands, and the stretch Jon reached on the 22nd day of the march was the specific ford that everyone alive knew by its name. The place where Robert Baratheon's warhammer had found Rhaegar Targaryen in the water, and Rhaegar had fallen, and the rubies from his armor had scattered across the riverbed where they still lay, caught in the stones, glinting at no one. Jon looked at the water before he crossed it. The river was shallow and brown in the late afternoon light, moving over pale stones, ordinary water, over an ordinary riverbed, except that it was not ordinary and the stones were not entirely stones. His father had died here, not the man who had raised him. The other one, the one whose blood and whose choices had set everything in motion, the war, the deaths, the 15 years of careful lies, and eventually Jon himself riding toward this water with a Dornish army behind him. He crossed the ford alone. Robb met him at the midpoint. The river came up to the horse's knees. The current moved around them quietly. Robb looked at Jon across the short distance of water between them, and Jon looked at Robb, and for a moment neither of them spoke because the weight of what was on the other side of this moment was large enough that it required the silence. Then Jon said, "You look like a Dornishman." They embraced in the middle of the ruby ford, in their armor on horseback, which was awkward in the practical sense and was the only way either of them could manage it without either of them making it into something more than it was, which would have been wrong, which would have made it smaller. Robb pulled back. He looked past Jon at the Dornish host on the south bank, the orange standards, the golden spears, the columns disappearing back along the road into the distance. He looked for a long time. "You actually brought them," Robb said. Jon said, "I said I would." "How many?" "Enough." Behind them both, Oberyn Martell rode his horse to the northern edge of the ford and stopped. He looked at the northern host assembled on the far bank, the direwolf banners, the gray and white, the iron faces of men who had marched from the neck. Oberyn raised his spear once, vertical, the morning light on the steel tip. Silence from the northern bank. Then the great Jon Umber, 8 feet of him in boiled leather, raised his axe above his head. What followed was not a cheer. It was older than a cheer. It was the sound that armies make when they have found the thing they were looking for, the specific noise of commitment rather than celebration. And it moved north and south along both banks simultaneously, and Jon felt it in the water under his horse's feet. That evening, in a camp south of the ford, Jon wrote to Stannis Baratheon at Dragonstone. He did not ask. Oberyn had spent 3 months teaching him the difference between asking and offering, and Jon had learned it the way he learned most things, by losing first and adjusting. The letter said, "I do not claim the throne. I claim justice for Robert Baratheon's death and the false imprisonment of Eddard Stark. If you will serve as Lord of Dragonstone and the 7 Kingdoms' law, the keeper of every legal record, the arbiter of every proceeding, the man who ensures this court operates within the law's full boundaries, I will guarantee that every decision made under my name is documented, defensible, and subject to your review. Dorne will support this arrangement in full. So will the North." It was the offer Stannis could not logically refuse, because it was precisely what Stannis had always wanted. Not the throne, which was loud and full of people who wanted things, but the law, which was clean and absolute, and had been repeatedly ignored by everyone who had sat the throne for 20 years. Jon was offering Stannis the law. Stannis had spent his entire adult life waiting for someone to offer him the law. The reply came 2 days later by Raven. "I will attend you at King's Landing." 3 sentences. No salutation, no closing courtesy. Pure Stannis, the most efficient possible confirmation that a man of law had made a legal assessment and reached a conclusion. That night, Jon sat by a fire south of the Trident, with Robb on one side and Arya on the other. Arya had arrived with the rear contingent of the northern host 2 days before, attached to a supply column in a manner that suggested she had arranged her own attachment and that nobody had been entirely certain at what point to stop it. She had found Jon across a campground full of soldiers and had walked up to him and looked at him for a long moment, taking in the armor and the spear and whatever else the past year had added to him. And then she had said, "You're different." Jon had said, "So are you." She was also, unmistakably, still Arya. Now she sat on the other side of the fire and prodded it with a stick, in the particular idle way she had always prodding, and the 3 of them said almost nothing, because they were Starks and Starks did not require noise to be together. Ghost lay between Jon and the fire. His white fur caught the light and held it. Robb looked at the flames for a long time. Then he looked at Jon. "Who are you now?" he asked, not unkindly, with the genuine curiosity of a man who had watched someone he loved leave as one person and arrive as something more complicated. Jon thought about the pool at the Water Gardens at dawn, his reflection looking back at him from the still water. 3 names, none of them complete. "I'm still working on it," he said. Robb nodded slowly. This was a Stark answer, and he accepted it as one. Arya prodded the fire. The flames shifted. The camp settled around them into its nighttime sounds. Horses and low voices and distant metal and the river moving north in the dark toward the sea. Jon sat between his brother and his sister at a fire south of the place where his father had died. And the weight of everything the word father now contained was something he would have to carry for the rest of his life. And he understood this, and he sat with it the same way he had sat on the tower stairs in the dark, very still, for a long time. Jon sent terms first. This was not Oberyn's preference. Oberyn had stated his position clearly at the War Council the night before. "Every day we wait outside these walls, more people inside starve or die from what waiting does to enclosed cities. Sieges are for men who are afraid to bleed. Jon had agreed with the assessment and modified the approach. We offer terms first. Always. We are not here to burn the city. We are here because the city has been taken from its rightful governance, and offering terms makes that distinction legible to everyone watching. The terms were sent at first light. Joffrey abdicates. Cersei surrenders. The garrison stands down. Every citizen is protected. Cersei refused before mid-morning. Joffrey refused. On Cersei's instruction shortly after, the assault began. 3 armies entered King's Landing simultaneously. Robb's northern and Riverlands host came through the Gate of the Gods, driving in from the King's Road, heavy infantry in gray and bronze moving in the methodical, ground-eating way of men raised in cold country who understood the difference between spending themselves and using themselves. Stannis Baratheon's forces came from the harbor on the east, his fleet having cleared the chain at the mouth of the Blackwater before anyone in the city thought to close it. And Jon's Dornish van drove through the river gate, Oberyn at the front, the golden spears behind him in their orange and black. The city watch lasted approximately 1 hour. They were not cowards. They were men whose salary had come from the Lannister family's continued occupancy of power, and when they looked at the walls from inside and saw 3 separate forces entering from 3 separate directions with no relief column anywhere on the horizon, they made the calculation of men who have always been paid to hold a position and have determined that the position has ceased to be holdable. They put down their weapons, they opened the gates they were guarding, they went home. Jon moved through the streets of King's Landing at the front of Oberyn's van, and found them to be exactly as chaotic as every account of urban fighting he had absorbed from Sarah Lester and from Oberyn over the previous year had prepared him for. He was not the largest fighter in the street, he was not the strongest, he was the most adaptive, which was the quality that mattered in a city where every alley was a potential choke point, and every corner was a potential reversal, and the situation changed faster than any predetermined plan could survive contact with. He read the streets the way Oberyn had taught him to read opponents, not their current position but their committed next one. He used the spear to control distance. He communicated with hand signals. He kept moving. The Dornish soldiers behind him followed with the loyalty of men who had watched someone for months and decided at some point they could not individually name that he was worth following into narrow streets. Not the loyalty of soldiers following a lord's banner, the older kind, fighters following a fighter, which does not require flags. Podrick stayed at his left side throughout. This was where Jon had placed him and where Podrick remained without requiring the instruction to be repeated. Before the Red Keep fell, Jon broke off from the main assault. He went for the dungeons. The cells beneath the Red Keep were damp, cold, the air carrying the specific smell of stone and standing water and human occupation over a long period. Jon moved through the corridors with a torch in his free hand, and Podrick at his shoulder, who had memorized the guard rotation from a map acquired 2 days outside the city, and who stopped Jon at a specific door without hesitation. Ned Stark was inside. He was alive. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, pale in a way that had nothing to do with northern skin, and everything to do with what weeks in a Lannister cell does to a man. His leg was wrong. The injury from the ambush on the Street of Steel when Jaime's men had moved against him, poorly set or not set at all. He had a beard that had grown past the point of deliberateness. He looked up when the torchlight came through the door. He looked at Jon's face in that light for a long moment, and something moved through his expression. Not simply relief, something more layered than relief, carrying 15 years of weight in it. He said, "I'm sorry." Jon said, "Don't be. Tell me later. Right now we need to move." He got Ned upright. He took the weight of Ned's arm over his shoulder. Podrick took the other side without being asked, which was how Podrick handled most things that needed handling. They moved. Jaime Lannister was in the throne room. He had not fled, because nothing Jon had been told about Jaime Lannister by anyone who knew him suggested he would flee when a fight was available. He stood in front of the Iron Throne with his sword drawn and his white Kingsguard cloak on, the last Kingsguard standing in a castle that had already fallen, with the expression of a man who has decided that whatever comes next will at least happen properly. Oberyn stood at Jon's back in the doorway. Jon walked in. Jaime looked at him the way Jaime looked at everything, the fighter first, the politics after, the rest of the context whenever there was time. He took Jon's measure across the length of the throne room with the assessing eye of the best swordsman in Westeros, evaluating whether a new opponent is worth his full attention. "You're younger than I expected," Jaime said. "You're older than I expected," Jon said. Jaime almost smiled. Where did they find you? Some northern holdfast with cold stone and no warmth? Winterfell, Jon said. He stopped walking. And Sunspear. Jaime's eyes moved to the spear at Jon's back and the sword at his hip, and he processed the combination, and something shifted in his assessment. The fight was short. Jaime was fast, genuinely, unambiguously fast, with the technical mastery of a man who had been the finest at this specific thing for 20 years. He came forward with 3 quick cuts, each designed to establish a rhythm and exploit the 4th beat of the rhythm. The first cut worked. The second almost worked. The third didn't, because Jon had already changed what he was doing. He went inside Jaime's guard on the 3rd beat instead of the expected 4th, took the grapple at close range, used the Dornish hold that Oberyn had drilled into him through 100 iterations in the training yard at Sunspear, and put Jaime's sword arm at an angle it was not designed to occupy. He could have ended it. He didn't. He let go. He stepped back. He lowered his sword. "This is not the fight that matters," Jon said. He kept his voice level. "Joffrey is gone. Cersei is captured. You can die here with a clean sword, or you can live and be useful. Those are the actual options." Jaime looked at him. His sword arm moved carefully, testing the joint. "My father will want to negotiate," Jaime said. "Your father is surrounded," Jon said. A long moment, Jaime Lannister looked at the throne room he was defending, and the young man standing across from him carrying a Dornish spear and a Stark sword, and something in his expression that was not triumph and was not rage, and was not anything Jaime had encountered across a sword. Before, he considered what was available to him. He sheathed his sword. Cersei Lannister was found in Maegor's holdfast with Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella. When Jon entered, she looked at him with the fury of a Lannister who has lost and has decided that fury is the only thing still entirely hers. "You are a bastard," she said, "who was given a name and a sword and a pretty Dornish girl, and you think that makes you a king." He looked at her steadily. "The name and the sword and the Dornish girl are just the things I happen to love." He told the guards to take Cersei to comfortable quarters, not a cell, because she was still the Dowager Queen until a trial said otherwise. Myrcella and Tommen were to be housed well and treated with complete respect. They were children and had done nothing. Joffrey would be confined pending trial. Joffrey closed his mouth. Joffrey closed his mouth. The throne room was enormous and quiet, and smelled of old iron and the particular ancient dust of a place where power has been conducted for 300 years. Jon walked to the Iron Throne and stood before it. It was not beautiful. Every account of it he had ever heard was accurate. 1,000 swords of the vanquished, melted and beaten into the shape of a seat, the blades not smoothed but preserved in their edges and angles, something deliberate in its brutality. Aegon the Conqueror had shaped it himself, and the result was a thing that looked like what power actually was rather than what power preferred to present itself as. Arianne stood beside him. She looked at the throne, and then at Jon, and said nothing. Jon sat down. The iron dug into his thighs and back immediately, and without apology. There was an old story that the throne cut those who sat in it carelessly, that the swords still held their edges, and Jon could feel the truth of that in the specific and deliberate pressure of old steel through his armor. He did not shift. He did not adjust. He simply sat with it, the way he had learned to sit with things that were heavy and could not be put down. Ned Stark entered from the side door, walking with a makeshift cane, pale and hollowed in a way that time would address but had not yet. He walked to the foot of the dais and stopped. He looked at Jon on the throne. He did not bow. He had earned specifically and completely the right not to. He nodded once. Jon nodded back. From the opposite door, Stannis Baratheon entered in dark gray armor with 2 men-at-arms behind him, wearing the expression he wore in all rooms, the expression of a man who is applying law to circumstances whether the circumstances have asked for it or not. He stopped at the foot of the dais. He bowed, sharp, military, brief, the bow of a man who respects legitimate authority and has assessed that it is present. He straightened. "The realm is in debt," he said. "The law has been broken in 17 places I have already identified. 3 of them are structural and will require new statutes. The remaining 14 are procedural and correctable by decree." He looked at Jon. "Where would you like me to start?" Jon almost smiled. "The structural ones," he said. Arianne said quietly beside him, "Dorne says you should announce who you are, the full truth. Today," Jon was quiet for a moment. The throne pressed its edges into him. Below the dais, Ned watched him with the steady, patient attention of a man who has been waiting for this specific decision for 15 years. and has decided that Jon is the one who makes it. Ghost sat at the base of the throne with his red eyes open, watching the room. "Not today," Jon said. "Today I am Jon Baratheon Stark, who won a war for the realm and sat the throne that had been taken from it." He paused. "Tomorrow we will see what name the realm needs." Arianne looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, with the full weight of the decision behind it. She understood the distinction, not hiding from the name, choosing when to be ready for it. He had learned the difference, and she had watched him learn it, and she trusted what he had learned. There was a difference. The Raven from Casterly Rock arrived the following morning. Tywin Lannister offered terms. His armies would stand down. The Lannister treasury would settle a substantial portion of the crown's accumulated debt. He asked, not as a supplicant but as a man stating a considered preference for the physical safety of his children. He did not beg, because Tywin Lannister did not beg. The letter ended with a single line. Jon read it twice. He held the parchment for a moment without expression. Then he handed it to Ned without comment and watched Ned read it. "Tell the boy I underestimated him." Robb rode north 2 days later. The North needed its king. That was simply true, and Robb was the king in the North, and the place that had made him was asking for him back. Before he left, he and Jon stood one last time in the throne room in the late afternoon, without ceremony or audience. Robb said, "You were always going to end up here." Jon looked at the throne. "I wasn't going anywhere," he said. "I was just following the road." Robb gripped his shoulder with the full weight of his hand, and no performance in it. Then he embraced him. Then he was gone. North, home, where he had always been most himself, and where he was needed now. The throne room at sunset. The last light came through the high windows and long amber columns, the dust moving slowly in the air currents, the city audible outside in its careful settling, the sounds of a place that had been frightened and was beginning, tentatively and without certainty, to remember how to be itself. Voices in the streets. A market bell somewhere. A child. Jon sat on the throne. Arianne sat beside him in a smaller chair, dark hair loose, her orange silk catching the last of the light. Ghost lay asleep at the base of the throne with his chin on his forepaws, enormous and white and entirely at rest. Ned stood at the door with Stannis. They were already talking in the low, purposeful register of men who have found a shared interest in the same problem, and they would not stop until they had built something that functioned. Somewhere in the south, in Sunspear, Doran Martell sat in his chair by the window. His maester read him the Raven's message. When the maester finished, Doran was quiet for a moment, looking at the last light over the desert beyond the window, the sand and the distance and the vast, patient landscape that had outlasted every king and every war, and every scheme of every clever man who had ever looked at it and thought himself more permanent than it was. He closed his eyes. He allowed himself a single, private, complete smile. The grass was still standing. The grass had outlived them all. On the throne, Ghost opened one red eye. He looked at the room, at the iron and the amber light and the humans arranged around it as though they had found, provisionally, the positions they were supposed to occupy. He closed his eye again. Satisfied, "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.